the platform. But
I'm
before
here.
we get on the platform, just like a hi Tessa, how are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Great. So I want to introduce Tessa at the moment. And as I was looking at your what I will call illustrious life, I just wanted to pick out a couple of things. The managing director of the Youth Lab, a think tank organization geared at young youth, a champion of national development, an educator teaching at both undergrad and grad level, an author, a political commentator, and an analyst. Where do you get time to just live life? This is a whole lot of things that you're doing. How do you balance it all?
Well, actually, one of the things I did to balance it all was I'm no longer the managing director of Youth Lab, but I have started my own development consultancy called Jasoro Consulting. I hope Nigerians
Okay.
actually recognize the word Jasoro as being a Yoruba word.
Okay.
And and yeah, I try to make sure that although my hands are in different pots, that the goal is still the same. The goal for me and what drives me is the development of young Africans and creating spaces for them wherever I go so that their voices can be heard, their suggestions can be heard, but more importantly, their lives can be improved. And so it may sound like a lot of things, but really they all have one thing in common, the development of young Africans.
The development of young Africans. I think that's an ongoing agenda and something that would be a legacy well beyond wherever we stop in our lives. And I think that's a commendable effort you're putting in. So just a quick one, we're talking about digital transformation and e-government. And when you hear the word digital transformation, it sounds like a revolution or something that seems like an uprising, the rise of the machines, or you see in certain movies. What is your quick definition of what it means and why it should be a very important topic to young people right now?
So for me, the digital revolution is about taking the technologies that we've had, taking the technologies that we're developing, and realizing that they're more and more encroaching on things that we used to think were only for humans to do. And so when we talk about something like AI, we're really saying that we are giving and we are empowering machines with the ability to do certain of the intellectual functions that human beings used to do. We come from a digital age and a technological age where our computers were mostly doing one single function rather than being able to do a complex of functions. So the difference between a computer being able to send a message, an instant message, is now going to be transformed into being able to send a message, interpret the message, and feed back from that message. So it means that the digital space is becoming more complex and more nuanced, taking on more human character, but giving us, I think, importantly, space for human beings to do more interesting things. I was in a conference last year with our presidential team on 4IR in South Africa. And one of the team made a really, really important point that one of the best opportunities that the digital revolution in terms of 4IR and merging some of those human functionalities and intelligences with technology is that we hope that it improves the dignity of people in that let's get the technology to do the things that are very menial so that we free up human beings to do things that are more complex, more sophisticated, more interesting, more creative. And so we have less human beings who are forced to clean toilets and more human beings who are freed up to use other parts of their intellect.
Okay, so you mentioned something that sounds really interesting, and I'm going to get back to that, where you talked about helping that technology starts to handle the menial stuff, the smaller stuff, so that it frees up human beings to focus on the more important, more life-changing events. I like that thought, and we're going to revisit that thought. But now let's link in e-governance. Let's link in e-government. How does e-government and digital transformation play off each other? Let's link that.
Sure. So what digital transformation, because of, again, this ability for it to start doing more complex things, and basically what technology is able to do and has been able to do over time is compress time and space. It creates efficiencies by compressing the time it takes to do things and compressing the space it takes to do things. And so that digital technology, when taken into the arena of governance and I would say democracy more broadly, can affect the way in which we participate in the way we govern our societies, right? So I'll talk about 5 areas that digital technology will interface with governance. The first one, and it's probably the most common one we think of, is something like elections. So the way we elect people can be transformed through digital technologies. It's already being transformed in many parts of the world. There are parts of the world where people don't queue anymore to go and cast their vote with their X. I know that New Zealand has a system where you can vote on your phone. So we're already seeing ways in which digital technologies is changing the way we do elections. But what it will also invariably do, and again, we've started seeing that trend in the last 5 to 10 years already, is change the way we engage with the people who seek to be elected. So if you think about the Barack Obama presidency and that election campaign, the first election campaign that he had, the big thing that he did differently from many candidates before him was the way he utilized YouTube, social media. He really changed the way that he engaged with the electorate beyond just going and doing a debate on television. And that made people feel like they were more in contact with him. That made people feel he was more accessible. And all of a sudden, his audience grew amongst young people in ways that were unexpected. So there's so many ways in which it can change the electoral system, the electoral cycle. But I think what's going to be interesting is whether or not it makes people vote for someone who's further away from them in terms of being able to touch base with a candidate who never comes to your door to knock. We know in Africa, we have a lot of door-to-door campaigning and the campaigning of T-shirts and food parcels. So is it going to eliminate the need for somebody to be in close proximity, or is it going to create new communities of proximity where if you can engage me in a place where you see me often, like online, then that's a new community of proximity that if you can't get to me there, then you can't get to me anywhere. If you can't know what's happening with my life, then you won't be able to get my vote. So I think elections is a definite opportunity. But I think the second thing that it's definitely going to change and has the opportunity to change if we let it is the question about accountability. And this is a really interesting one for me, because what we're seeing more and more, especially with social media and those kinds of spaces, is we're seeing leaders who are bringing themselves into those spaces, and they are the ones driving narrative and driving engagement with the electorate or with the citizenry. Donald Trump is a great example of that. Paul Kagame is an example of that. Uhuru Kenyatta is an example of that. People who are actively taking on digital spaces and driving agendas. And what I think we need to do as we progress is use these spaces much more dynamically so that as the citizen and as the electorate, we are the ones that can use it to drive accountability to them and make them accountable in public ways, on public platforms, in public ways through the technologies that we have. An example of this is in South Africa, there's a technology called GovChat. And GovChat is a private sector tool that has been developed that is connecting local municipalities to the citizenry. And so you would think that at a local government level, that citizens would feel like, oh, I know where my local councillor is, I can just go to his house. The truth is, many times our local councillors leave the communities they're supposed to serve. They're unresponsive, they are unaccountable, they don't have to face public scrutiny, and so they just derelict their jobs. On the GovChat platform, those people can be called out. There's a public record of that. People don't need to be literate in order to use the platform very much. And so you have a formalized form of accountability for a government that is accessible and very easy to use. And I think it's those kinds of things that we need to start thinking about more and more to make the processes that we have more dynamic. It's also linked to, and I'll say very little about this because it's so linked, but the question about participation and how we make participation much more agile, but also how we take the data from people. And I think that's one of the big joys about talking about big data, is that we know what chatter is in our communities and in our countries. We see it online all the time. We see people talking and engaging and participating. But when it comes to the decision-making tables of government, those voices are not heard because no one can count them. Well, the days of that are gone. And almost in real time now, big data gives us the ability not only to hear people's voices, but to count it, to analyze it, to make sense of it, and to take it into those government rooms and say this information matters as well. So it certainly can improve participation. And I hope that it goes from accountability and participation to the fourth thing, which is service delivery. If governments are smart, they will figure out how to harness technology. They will figure out how to in-house and in-source that technology, or even if they outsource it, but definitely have close relationships with the people who are driving technology so that it can improve service delivery. We can improve how quickly water gets into a person's home. We can improve how quickly housing is delivered to the people who are most vulnerable. We can improve how we provide social protection funds. We need to use this to improve the lives of people. We can improve our transport systems and make them more agile, more smart, get into different parts of our countries. The manufacture of our roads, if we come up with new technologies for that. So it must translate beyond just talk into action. And then the last thing I wanted to mention, because I think it's really important, and I'm hoping colleagues who are in Asia will be able to ask questions and give comments on this particularly. But the question around surveillance. One of the things that, and it's a positive and a negative, especially we've seen now during Corona, is that the more smart our technology is, the more governments have the power to watch us all the time and to surveil our lives and to know where we are and to know who we're with. And we're seeing in Asia, one of the strengths of South Korea is that they've got a really good system of surveillance. They know where somebody who's been positive with coronavirus is, they know where they've gone, they know who they've been in contact with all through their cell phone. And so we need to know that that surveillance power is there, but we also need to be wary of what it could be used for.
Great. So for those who are just joining in, we've just had a masterclass of how to intersect e-governance and the digital transformation that's going on. I want to quickly run through what Tessa had mentioned. She had mentioned the areas where technology or the digital transformation could help the government in terms of elections, accountability, participation, delivery, and surveillance. And all these she had mentioned, of course, have their downsides and have their upsides, but it's just to find out what the pros and the cons are and exactly what the agenda is and what we're quickly trying to solve. Brilliant. At this point, I just also want to quickly go back to what I mentioned earlier. A statement you made that interested me a lot. It was when you were talking about the digital transformation. The statement went something like this, that we hope that technology is able to do the menial stuff, so it frees up the minds of humans to be able to do the more pressing or life-changing things. The first question I'd like to ask is, what do you think the time frame to this point of sort of freedom and emancipation would be? And do you think that there are any present problems or challenges to this idea that we need to start mitigating right now?
Yeah, so for me, it's one of the big policy areas of the fourth industrial revolution, as it's colloquially called. And it links to this question about what's the future of work, right? And so I think part of the first thing in terms of timeline is how we conceive of what the full gamut of 4IR can mean for people's lives in terms of the kind of work that they can do. I think that there's firstly a fixation on tech itself and jobs in tech. And I think that while jobs in tech are a guaranteed part of the future, they're not the only part of the future of work. They're not the only thing that will become available to us. So when I say more high-level things, I don't necessarily mean that we all need to be coders. Coding is not necessarily the highest level of being able to engage our brains. And being able to work in tech is not necessarily the highest level of our human experience. So I think we firstly need to say that tech is an enabler for us to get to the point where we can solve big problems, but it's not the final solution in itself. The other part of it is the natural sciences. And I think we're going to have to need a very agile way to think about the natural sciences, because what we may find is that a lot of the natural sciences have very technical abilities that can be replaced by machines more than what, for instance, a humanities student's ability as a psychologist may not be able to be replaced as quickly. So I think we need to think about whose jobs are going to be at risk first, right? So if I gave you 3 jobs, a cashier, somebody who works at a grocery store, cashing out groceries, an accountant, or a dancer, whose job is the robot going to take over first? At a social justice level. Hey?
Yeah, I was like, probably the cashier and the accountant.
That's exactly it. And at a social justice level, given the low wages of a cashier, we hope it takes over cashier jobs first, right? Even though that means that a low-income worker may lose a job, what we need to be ready to do as society is upskill that person for a different job that the robots will come from later on, right? Then you talk about somebody like an accountant who's not necessarily a low-income worker. And that person's job is also at risk. And that person's job, because that person's job is technical, it's spreadsheets, it's in all sorts of things. How are we going to rethink accounting as a skill and be able to free up the accountant from just pressing in something into an Excel sheet into rethinking the way that money in, money out works, and innovating the way small businesses and informal traders do their books? We need to free them up from the menial thing of punching in numbers and being number crunchers to being rethinkers of society. In fact, it said that.
Basically send them back to school.
Well, yeah, and ask them to rethink their skills. It said that some of the best CEOs, especially of entrepreneurial companies, are chartered accountants who chose to think of themselves as more than number crunchers. So I think accountants are going to have to change how they do their work. But the person whose job of those 3 is least going to be affected is going to be the dancer. And so maybe we need to be talking more about Nollywood and the future of work. And we need to be saying we want to free up people from cleaning toilets and allow them to express themselves and get paid in the arts. Because nobody wants to watch a machine sing. I've yet to meet anyone who's really excited at the idea of watching a machine just belt out a note. So for me, how quickly we get there is dependent on how quickly we change our focus from simply talking about the tech, which is the means to the end, and talking more about what is the vision for society we want to use this to create. What society do we want to use the 4th Industrial Revolution to live in? If we answer that question, the quicker we answer the question of what society we're trying to create, the quicker we'll get there.
Amazing, amazing. I specifically like the note that nobody wants to hear robots sing. But I think it's really important, some key things you mentioned where we have to start thinking about actively the sort of jobs that will be affected, and immediately linking that to the policies that we put on ground. I think that is very important, and it's another way that these 2 things actually sync. because I hear a lot of people who are currently afraid and anxious about everything that has to do with AI and everything that has to do with technology coming into that space. And they look to governments to sort of provide some form of controlled environment and some form of security. And that's why I really think that what we're talking about right now is very important. I'm going to jump now and touch your political commentator and analyst side of your brain at this moment. So sitting back and having seen all you have seen, what are some of the policies that you think or conversations you think that we should be actively having right now that you're not seeing happening?
All right, so there are three big policy conversations that we need to be having. The first one is around how we value work differently. And it links to my previous point about what kind of work will be replaced more easily than others and all of that. And the important question of inequality. So how are we going to start valuing the efforts of a dancer differently from what we do now, right? So if you're a dancer in Nairobi, or actually even worse, if you're a dancer somewhere in a rural part of Kenya, you are not valued in your society the same way if you're a dancer in LA, right? So we are going to have to already start to think about how do we deal with those disparities. But just in the context of 4IR, certain jobs that we used to think are very high valued, the accountant, may not be as valuable anymore. What do we do with those disparities? What do we do with them? Do we just say, let the market decide? If so, who decides for the market? We have to be much more active in terms of saying things like, what will be the minimum wage in a 4IR society? What will be used as measures of value? How will we introduce social justice into the question about wages? What will be the role of things like social protection when we have a bloodbath of cashiers? So the question about value and rights needs to be answered in a policy way. The second big question that we need to answer is education and skills. One of the things that the International Labour Organization says about the fourth industrial revolution is that it will be a process of lifelong learning. And so we need to think about what does our formal education need to have in it necessarily in terms of skills versus the things that we'll be able to learn on our own throughout our lives. The International Labour Organization lists the top 10 skills that everybody's going to need in the fourth industrial revolution. And I wanted to read them to you. The top 10 skills are complex problem solving, critical thinking.
Could you read them slowly? Could you read them slowly so the attendants can also? Yes, thank you.
I will. So complex problem solving, critical thinking, creativity, people management, coordinating with others, emotional intelligence, judgment and decision making, having a service orientation, negotiation, and cognitive flexibility.
Wow, all this sound like artsy subjects.
Very artsy subjects. What I often think when I read that is that when I ask people what skills they think they'll need for the fourth industrial revolution, the answer is often coding. And what makes a good coder is actually their analytic abilities, their abilities to think about a problem that they want to solve with their code, their abilities to create. So I've never coded in my life, but I've created apps. I get invited to go to all the hackathons because I have the ability to problem solve. So I would much rather us have education systems that are teaching those top 10 skills as the base of our learning and make sure that everybody can do those skills than simply trying to focus on very particular technical skills. There are things that we're going to be able to learn throughout our lives, but we must think about what are the core things that our education must teach. And I think that's going to have to be different. And then the last area of public policy conversations that I think we need to be having is linked to the question around surveillance that I spoke about earlier. but it's the important question of data protection. In the age of the digital revolution, the greatest commodity that is being sold right now during our Zoom call is our data. By entering into this Zoom chat, some unknown human being in the world has just gotten access to information about us that they will sell to somebody else, probably in about 24 hours' time. The ability to sell our data is commodifying us. We have become the commodity. We are the thing that's being traded now. And there are ethical issues about that. There are human rights issues about that. There are questions around social justice and economic inequality about that, that only governance can protect us from. And so we need much smarter politicians who understand the value of data and surveillance in order to protect us in this new world where our data is being sold.
Great. I think that is very apt. Three key points for three strong pillars that I think ideologies need to be built on moving forward. And these concepts should be the framework through which we create our policies and guide us into a lot of decisions. So I'm going to read them out again. Tess mentioned how we value work, talking about the rights, minimum wage, social justice, and a whole lot of things that fall under this. She also mentioned education, and she reeled out the top 10 things that would be the skills that will be required in the next couple of years. And none of them was coding. Nothing was there about engineering. All these things are what we dismiss as soft skills. These are going to be the hard skills that are going to be looked for in the future. And finally, she touched on surveillance and the ethical questions that surround that. And these are conversations that she strongly believes that we, as young people, as professionals, should be having on a regular basis, and therefore also pushing this feedback to the powers that be that make decisions. Okay, at this point in time, so it's not just a conversation between Tessa and myself, although I'm enjoying this conversation as it is. A couple of questions have poured in. I would read one, and that question, I think you've touched on it, but to fulfill more righteousness, the question says, what's the future of work for a geographer like myself? What is important to upskill? So I think they're asking, if you're doing a course like geography or chemistry or something that you believe may not be valued in the next 10 years or the next 20 years, what should be your route out, or what should you be looking at to upskill? You've touched on it, but maybe you can add a bit of flesh around that again.
Sure. And I saw somebody asked if the top 10 skills can be put up. What I'll do is I'll try and do a screen share. I'll just try and find it and do a screen share before we close. For somebody who's a geographer, to think about your skill set as more than the technical ability to do maps and mapping, but more about having the science of space and place and location and locality, and having the creativity to think about how do we change space and place rather than just how do we map it, right? So if you're a geographer 20, 30 years ago, your job was about figuring out how we put on paper where different localities might be. I don't know enough about geography, so and geographers to get this 100% right, but go with me in theory. Now your job is being taken over by the fact that Google can now GPS and drop pins at the drop of a hat. Yeah. Google Earth has become the geographer. So now the role of the geographer is to say, okay, so now that somebody has mapped out the Earth, what do I do with that information to reconfigure space? So a friend of mine who I studied sociology with, he went to the London School of Economics as a sociologist, and he did a geography PhD. He had never done a day of geography in his entire schooling career. But he went and did a geography PhD because he was interested in how informal traders in cities were being displaced through gentrification, and how do you start to remake a city so that informal traders have a legitimate place in that city, as opposed to are seen as riffraff and people who are taking up space that's unnecessary. He got an entire PhD in geography by remapping the space in a city so that it's more inclusive of informal traders. That's what I think a geographer and people with very technical skills will have the space to do, is to think, how do I make this skill useful for the society I live in?
Great. So I hope that it's helpful. So it goes beyond, it's thanking technology for how far they've come. And then, like you mentioned, Tess, now being a bit more creative about the information you have at hand. And I love the example you gave about the individual who was trying to solve a problem. So I think if I could add something to what Tessa has said, look out for a problem and then try and use your understanding of geography to solve that problem. Amazing. Pandora's box is opened up. Tess, you got a lot of questions that have started pouring in. Okay, so I'm going to take question number 2, because question 1 is a bit similar to what was already asked, and I'll come back to that. I completely agree with the importance of data. What do you think about the threat of the GAFA towards mass control of data globally? What do you think about the threat of the GAFA towards mass control of data globally? What can an individual do on a micro level?
I don't know what the GAFA is.
Okay, so we need you, Gupta, to shed some more light on the GAFA. So please, if you can, do that. Let's move to the next question. How do you reconcile the amorous nature of these skills with the reality of the job market and how people are categorized and hired? Although the needs for these skills are embedded in job descriptions, jobs are still defined by technical skills. When and how will this change?
So the when and the how is about, number one, how quickly our technology responds to those technical skills and starts to replace them, right? So in African context, there are questions like the handheld hoe. So the African Union, in its Agenda 2063 policy, said that they want to put aside, or we want to get rid of, the use of the handheld hoe in farming, so that we're not out in the field with a handheld hoe, busy beating around to farm. So you need to think about what you're trying to get rid of and why you're trying to get rid of it, and then employ technology to help you get rid of that. So it's not going to happen just organically. Technology doesn't make itself. It's going to take us looking at the problems in our society, as you've put it, and us directing technology towards it, directing technology towards the things that we think can be replaced so that human beings don't have to do it. And then ask yourself, what are you opening that human being to be able to do? So we don't also just want to replace things for the sake of replacing them. We want to replace them because there's something else that the human being that's doing X should be doing. And we need to know what the other thing is that they should be doing is before we just cancel out the first thing that they are doing. So it's very much dependent on us figuring out what problem we want to solve and what kind of skills we want people to focus their efforts on instead.
Great. I hope that answered the question. We got the GFA, Tessa, so we're learning something new today. Thank you, everybody. It means Google, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook. So I'm going to read the question again. I completely agree with the importance of data. What do you think about the threat of Google, Amazon, Apple, and Facebook towards mass control of data globally? And what and what can I or we as individuals do on a micro level? Thank you, Gupta. I've learned something from you today.
Absolutely. That's an important question. It's probably one of the biggest questions. If it goes unanswered, is a major threat to country economies and to global economies. So firstly, that is a oligopoly if I've ever seen one. right? You've got four big companies that, because they got there first when it came to data, they have such a monopoly on data, its access, its trade, the price of data, and in a environment that hasn't been regulated for a long time. We're starting to see more and more regulation now, but it's also regulators by regulators who are 70 years old and have to be taught a lot of things about data before they're at the sophisticated levels that Facebook is able to hide data. So we're going to need to be a generation of young people who don't just participate and happily participate with the big four, but we are going to have to be the group, the generation that challenges the big four and its ethics. I think the ethics question is the first big question. Give us transparency to how it works, what the trade secrets are, what's going on out there, what's deal making, what's the value of data. We need ethics around transparency. Otherwise, we're all going to be stabbing in the dark. We'll all be saying to Facebook, tell us how many, give people access to their information. Facebook will tell you, oh no, people have complete access to their information. If they just read the terms and conditions on page 15 in link 4, they would know that they could swipe left and no one can see that. You don't even know what you're asking for the most part. So the ethics around transparency is the first big one that we need to get through with them. The second thing for me is about localizing our own economic data centers. So for me, if I think about WeChat, for example, I think WeChat is a really good example of a localized solution that does the same things that a WhatsApp does, and various other things, of course, but is an effort of a localized version so that you can control more of what happens, control more of what the data is, where it goes, who has access to it. And I think in Africa particularly, we have the problem that we are being told what we should be is app creators. So we're being told by Facebook, Google, guys, create apps, learn how to code and create apps. The app is very far down the value chain. There's many things that have happened before we get to being app creators. Being app creators is not actually being a creator and an owner of the value chain. The owner of the value chain is the one who's going to own the information that comes on your app. So we need to start swimming upstream in the value chain and start being a competitor to Google rather than somebody who's just creating an app for Google's App Store.
Well, I actually like the last point in terms of being told to create apps. I think we should also have an understanding of the value chain. I think that's a bit of a business education right there. But importantly, I like the idea of localizing whatever apps you're doing so that you can have some form of control and have some form of checks and balances to how information goes out. Okay, so let me read a quick question again from Benjamin. He says, how can we make education more specific for students to help prepare them for the future? What are the specific entry points? Who do we need to involve? Looking at this from a local angle again.
Yeah, so there are different kinds of education streams that we need. I think everybody's education needs those top cognitive skills that I spoke about earlier. I think if we don't have that, we're going to leave a lot of people behind. There are some university programs, and I think America's probably done this much before everybody else did, but in a different way, where when you come into undergrad, you're doing a liberal arts program. You're learning about, regardless of whether you want to be a doctor or whatever, you get the opportunity to choose, I want to do a sociology course now, and I want to do a history course here, and I want to do a this, and I want to do a that. So that when you transition to being a doctor, you've been exposed to other things other than just medical learning. And so this has a similar feel to it, where when you enter into the learning space, that core cognitive learning set of skills, I think everybody needs to have. But then we need what I call pathways of education. And people who are able to, number one, choose a pathway, but also move between pathways. So a pathway might be we want you to learn particular technical artisanal skills, what we would now think about as TVET or vocational training, where you're learning how to be a plumber or a this or that. So you could choose a path. So instead of learning everything there is to learn about geography, because that's it's a set course and you just can't get away from it, I would rather at some point in the education system, somebody is able to take an artisanal path and learn very specifically where that's going to lead them and what that's going to do for them, right? But they must also have some freedom to be able to move between paths. So we need connections between paths. Because the one thing we've learned about the nature of work now, it's different from, I'm 36 years old, so different from my parents' generation who are now in their 60s and 70s, is my mother has spent 50 years working in exactly the same industry. I have spent 15 years working and I've traversed 3 different industries already. So we know that the pathway of your career is not going to be linear anymore. So we need the ability to jump between or segue between different pathways. So I might be on an artisanal track, but then as an artisan, while I'm learning how to do nails, I realized that actually I want to build a business around being able to do nails. So now I need to be able to segue into a business track so I can learn how to build a business, which is, I think, one of the most important tracks we're going to have is entrepreneurial learning and learning how to build organizations and businesses. But on the other hand, while I'm busy doing my business, I might realize that I need to build an app and I need to do, build some tech. I need to be able to segue towards that so that I understand tech, even if I'm not going to build the app with my own hands. So we need an education system that has pathways, but has pathways that are connected to each other. At the base is that analytic learning.
Great. So what I hear, and if I can just try and summarize and correct me if I'm wrong, is first of all, there needs to be sort of a generic foundation where certain topics or certain things are taught or allowed to be taught on a certain level. You mentioned how, for example, a medical doctor could do something in sociology and touch a bit of other courses before they go into their primary function. So a very generic base where you can have an idea, a 360 understanding of everything around you and how your primary course interplays with these other environments. Another thing you talked about is the pathways. And I think this falls on the education system to be able to create flexible pathways to allow for a full experience on education, which is beyond just getting a quick degree, but more of the holistic view to the human being you're trying to become and the value you're trying to create, so that when you come out, you're just more than the degree, like you mentioned, you're a problem-solving machine. So the pathways are very important. So I think it goes also back to the government and how the government intersects with communities and how we start to understand what the basic need is. I think that's an amazing concept in terms of pathways and having a very generic or open foundation level where you can learn a lot before going into your primary focus. I'm going to quickly jump into the chats because I see that I've ignored our chat room and there are a couple of questions in our chat room. I'll try to pick out one. A question goes, what is the population focus that the government should target for the adoption of digital technology, as not everyone is computer literate? And what time frame would there be significant benefits of the digital technology for all, including skilled workers whose works are sidelined for digital adoption? I think this is a very robust question. There are a lot of various elements in that. So go ahead, Tess, give us your view.
Yeah, if I was the government, I would start with needs. I would start with young people somewhere between the ages of 16 and 24 and make sure that we have an army of young people who have a base digital literacy that gives them a good understanding of how to use tech, right? Not only as consumers of tech, but also understand some of the back end on how tech works. That would be something I would focus on right now. And the reason is, if you think about people who age between kind of the 16 to 24, they have two things that they could do with great ease. They can affect the younger generation. People younger than them, they are able to influence. Many of them are also going to be future parents. People between those ages are very, very much readying themselves to be parents, but they can have an influence on younger people. Steering for Greatness is a great example of that, where you have this cohort of teenagers that are being led by a group of volunteers in their early 20s. So they can look downwards in terms of age, and they can mentor people up. But what they can also do is they can go straight into the world of work, and they can complement and supplement the already existing workforce with complementary technological skills. So I'm not going to force a 58-year-old to learn everything there is to know about how to navigate technology. But it's great to have a 24-year-old step into the workplace and be able to complement that 58-year-old in being able to bridge the digital divide that they have. So my focus would be on that army of NEETs, 18 to 24, the army of people who are in school in that space as well, and make them as digitally savvy as we possibly can so that they can influence both generationally in both directions.
Great. So I guess that touches on the age range or the demographic. It touches on how you go about it. And you also touched a bit on what to do with those who don't currently understand, because in the workplace, you have also the baby booming generation who are a bit concerned about their usefulness as well. And what we're trying to tell them is you're not useless, but we're going to help complement the knowledge gap that might be apparent in the organization. So that's a good one. One of the questions here, you had touched on it, but I think they just joined, so just touching it again. The question is, how do you compensate for the professional workers whose jobs are on the line with the technology adoption? You had touched on that briefly, but just reiterate, please.
The short answer is, number one, you figure out what's the other things that they could be doing now that the job that they have might be replaced, and you skill them towards that. So in the banking industry, when you used to have tellers, they were professional workers, they were tellers, they were taking money, counting money, putting that money aside. Now you have a new banking universe. There's a bank in South Africa who has decided that it's going to get into the car insurance space. So you already have a teller. That teller's job is now being replaced by technology because technology can count the money. But now you have an insurance part of your business as the bank, and that teller can be upskilled to be an insurance broker that's helping people manage their insurance portfolio. So it's about upskilling professional workers to a predetermined end that you have seen an opportunity of value in. And the second thing about professional workers that is critically important, really, is that what you don't want to do with professional workers is limit them to only being within one professional space, right? So I just gave an example of one professional space. You stay in the banking industry. What we need to be able to encourage professional workers to do is have the courage and the skill set to innovate and take on entrepreneurship. I found that on the continent, many people who kind of gravitate towards entrepreneurship and choose entrepreneurship are people who have been in the world of work. There are a lot of survivalist entrepreneurs in Africa, but the people who often choose it themselves are people who've been exposed to the world of work and understand how it works. So I'd like to see much more of those people who are having their skills displaced, looking for new opportunities that they can create for themselves.
Great. Wow. So we're run out of time. But just a last word from Tessa Dooms. I wish you could hear everyone applauding. We've been getting a lot of, oh, blow my mind. This has been amazing. So we thank you for your time, Tessa. But before you go, is there any thought you would like to leave with the audience that you think is important for us to feed on? And are there any other resources that the audience can go to if they want to continuously educate themselves? As well, if you like, you could share also things you're doing, maybe your linked social media handles, so that we can get involved and get to know more about you through your work.
All right. So final things that I'd like to leave us with in terms of ideas and things to think about is that for me, the digital revolution in terms of the future of work and the future of government is based on answering the question, what kind of society do we want to use these things to build? And I think if we answer that question for ourselves as individuals, for our families, for our communities, for our countries, for our region, we will be able to use technology well. The focus isn't the technology. The technology is a means to the end. We must ask, what is success? What does success look like? What type of society are we trying to build? The second question that I would leave everyone with is the question about, once the robots come, what will be left for humans to do? And we need to think about what makes humans special. What do we want to have replaced and what don't we want to have replaced? I mean, I made a joke about the singing, but more important than the singing, I don't want a robot as my social worker. I don't want a robot that's supposed to be empathizing with me at a time of grief. Even if it's possible, doesn't mean that it should be done. There are certain things that are sacrosanct about the human experience, and we need to have a conversation about what they are so that we don't replace things that don't need to be replaced and could much rather better be done by humans, even if one day AI knows how to empathize. I don't care. That's not who I want helping me through grief. And then the final thing is, especially for Africa, in the last few years, Africans have been talking about, in the same way that the West does and the East does, about gig economies. And when you talk about gig economies, people get really excited. Oh, yes, we want to be in the gig economy. We want to just be freelance writers, and we want to be bloggers, and we want to be vloggers, and we want to be all of those things, right? And in the same breath, we look down on the informal economy in Africa. We look down the informal economy. We do not treat it like it is a necessary thing. We do not treat it like it's valuable. The gig economy is just the informal economy that went to private school. That's real. And COVID-19 is showing us that. The gig economy is informal workers. They just happen to be a different kind of informal worker. And so for me, it's how do we really start to use the digital age to value the informal sector in Africa more? Because I think if we focus on that, there's so much that sector adds to our lives and adds to our economies, and we should value it. In terms of how people can, or what kind of resources are out there, I think people should really be looking at following the studies that are coming out around the IOL. The World Bank is doing some interesting stuff, but also within the entrepreneurship space. And these are not necessarily academics, but entrepreneurs are learning as they go about what's useful and what's not, quicker than the academics are and quicker than the scientists are. And so I would say we need to learn more from entrepreneurs who are learning as they go, who are figuring the stuff out as they go. The biggest learnings that I've had around the digital space has been through hackathons. And I think hackathons are something we should embrace wholly in different forms and use them as thinking spaces to share amongst each other and figure out how we're going to navigate this life thing and the world we're living in together. In terms of keeping track with me, I'm on social media. So I'm on Twitter more than anywhere else. And my handle I will put into the chat. And then on Facebook, my name and surname will help you find me there. And those are really the ways you can get a hold of me then. And the company I run is Jasoro Consulting, and that will give you a sense of some of my work life. And I'm on LinkedIn on my name. That's about it.
Great, thank you so much, Tess. Tess, thank you. You've been amazing. You've been a channel of education and insight to us here, and everyone who has logged in to listen to you. I don't think we'll say this was time wasted at all. This was almost invaluable, if you ask me. So for everyone who joined us, yes, we're wrapping up now, but that doesn't mean the content is done. We still have another session today, 6 p.m. West African time. What you have just been a part of has been digital transformation and e-governance. And the next session will be starting by 6 p.m. Please take a break, stretch your legs, look through your notes again, digest what you've just heard, because I'm pretty sure it was useful to everyone. And we'll meet you again by 6 p.m. The Zoom ID and passwords have been sent to your emails. If you did register, you can still register. Just look for us on our social media platform. That is on Twitter at Stare to Greatness. Stare to Greatness, the word stare, the number 2, and greatness. On Facebook, Staring for Greatness Foundation. Staring for Greatness Foundation. On Instagram, at Staring for Greatness. And on LinkedIn, Staring for Greatness Foundation. As soon as you reach out to any of these touch points and platforms, you'll be able to see more of what we do and the programs that we're running during the year. With that, I want to say thank you. Tess, again, thumbs up to you. More winds beneath your sails, you know, and may you continue to go on to accomplish great and awesome things. I will personally follow you.